what we're looking at is how we store memories. And I'm going to narrow this down to three memory systems for the storage of memories, in particular traumatic memories, that matter to us with mastering and integrating trauma. So we've got semantic, rules, meanings, interpretations. Then we've got what's becoming called episodic. In the literature, there was an episodic literature, and there was an event memory literature, there was an emotional memory literature, and it's all being kind of subsumed with doubled work, and it's all kind of becoming episodic. I've persisted in calling it event memory for a long time, just because it forces us to look at these three different forms of memory. And then the third one is procedural. Procedural is the vast majority. Depending on how you slice it, it's 95, 99, 99.99% of the memory is procedural. That just means autopilot. It's very expensive for our brain to do semantic memory. It's very expensive for it to do event or episodic memory. Procedural memory is we learn patterns and we repeat those patterns, and the vast majority of what we do, vast is procedural. When we're working with traumas, we have to address all three. The nice thing about single event traumas, I'm in a car wreck, doesn't matter how terrible it was, I'm in a car wreck, it doesn't matter if I just hurt myself or if my entire family was killed except for me and I drove, which would be, right, a nightmare in the complexity. Still, you've just got to work with semantic memory and event memory for that. You don't have to touch procedural memory because it just happened. Patterns haven't formed. When you work with sustained trauma, trauma that went for what Judith Herman called captivity trauma, people call complex trauma or type 2 trauma, where it's gone on for months or years, the person has begun to adapt to it as if that's simply going to be the reality. And Judith Herman focuses on how you sort of collapse and accept that. You can use that, and I'm not saying that's not right. I'm not even judging it. I'm saying aside from that, there is a simple proceduralization. The longer you're in the traumatic state and you are habituating being in the traumatic state, you are habituating to the traumatic environment, to whatever is threatening you. Those become proceduralized. So you cannot simply do exposure therapy with a wonderful relationship and be really smart for them to figure out meaning. You'll never get there. You can spend your entire life and you will hardly scratch the surface of it because it's proceduralized. Mm. You've still got to do meaning. You still have got to work with event memory through various kinds of exposure, like Peter Levine's work is all about. It's a form of exposure therapy. But you've got to work with repetition. You're talking hundreds of repetitions. So learning, like the relational abilities, like the no and the yes, they require hundreds and hundreds of repetitions before they stick. This client who I turned into a different imaginary client who had the friend Paul and Paul's father. So for her to imagine Paul's father, as a good father, she would have to have a focused imagination around that for hundreds and hundreds of hours, focused on actually imagining that Paul's father is her father. She's not getting rid of the memories of what happened with her father. She's building in solutions, she's building in resources, and she is creating an overlay in her mind of an alternate past with alternate rules for how to be in the world. She can actually build on that and live from that. We're going to talk more about that next time. Mm. The point is, a huge amount of our field, Ferenczi in the 30s talked about this. He was one of Freud's students. And he talked about so much of therapy is about fundamental patterns in the personality structure, which are profoundly habituated. So how do we work with that? And if you look at a lot of the literature from Genet and Freud up through all sorts of people, up through Bowen and the wonderful family and all the family systems work that was done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they didn't have this memory system map. So they just went in and they just kind of tried to work with people with what they perceived and what they learned. We can go back to their work through the lens of the three memory systems, and we can see, oh, depth psychoanalysis is focused on semantic memory. It was doing great stuff. Oh, it was doing a little bit. It was doing some event memory also with some exposure. And it wasn't doing anything with procedural memory, which is why you had people going to analysis for 2 hours a day, 3 days a week for 20 years, because there was something around repetition that was desperately needed, but they didn't have the vocabulary or the concept. They had no way to create a theoretical model around it. And instead, they could have maybe gone once a week instead of 3 times a week. And they could have given their clients exercises to do at home so they can get the hours in. When I was working with Peter Levine, I was spending 10 to 100 hours, depending on my back and forth schedule, because I was in a different town, on focused meditations. So I did a minimum of an hour a day, sometimes more, doing a focused exercise that was either resourcing, solution building, doing something with mastery, or building yes or no abilities, or integrating stresses. So depending on how long he was out of town, I was spending 10 to 100 hours. I kept track of it. I charted it. And so he just came in for the tough stuff. So when I went down to sit down with sessions with him and we had taken a history together, I could just point at the traumas that we worked, and we would work on those traumas together. So I was getting him working at his absolute most focused best. And I was doing the repetition work outside of the therapy. Does that make sense? We're going to come back to this in a big way because a lot of what looks like resistance in a system, recalcitrance, stubbornness, continuation of we do all this work. Why do we have such a small impact? First guess is because it needs repetition. If you took piano lessons and you never practiced, you didn't get better. The kids who practiced got better. The kids who didn't practice didn't. It's the same thing for behaviors in our mind, in our personality. We're going to come back to that in more depth. And what does that mean clinically when we look at this? What does this mean when we check things in research?